evening, everybody. Hello and welcome to this Wednesday night Bible study here at Faith Baptist Church's Facebook and YouTube Live. We're so glad to have everybody this evening. Hello, Sylvia. Good to see you popping up in both chats. Thank you to everybody who supported. Let's see, Amanda and Sylvia from a few seconds and a few minutes ago. We appreciate you guys so much. Tonight we're going to continue the lesson that we started last week in 1 Samuel 18. Looking forward to it. It's a fun chapter. It's a continuation of the story of David and Goliath and sort of the in-between of David being the kid that slayed Goliath. Hello, Mom. Good to see you popping up in chat too. And him becoming the king. You know, and it tells that story that's told in between there. Really great stories. Very relatable to a lot of what we go through in life. So hope you enjoy it. Tonight, if you guys have a prayer request, something you'd like for us to pray for, be sure to leave a message. Let me know. I'll do my best to read that for everybody, and we'll make sure everybody knows to pray for these things. I don't think I've received any new updates. Amanda, is there anything new we need to pray for?
I haven't received any new ones.
Okay, I haven't either. So I don't have anything else. Without further ado, we will go ahead and jump over to the story. I don't know. This might be a short lesson this evening. Because it's a continuation of last week's lesson, so it's not like a full chapter's story. So whenever we're done, we're just done. So I'm going to jump over to the Bible now. All right, there we go. Let's see. So we're going to start this evening in let's take another look at verse 3 real quick. We read verses 1 through 5. There's a couple of other things I want to get to before we read out the rest of it. So it says in verse 3, "Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul." Sorry, that was at the dog. That was not at a person. So David and Jonathan made a covenant together. Now, a covenant in the Bible is a special kind of promise to each other. And it was concerning this friendship that they both valued so very much. So it's a very special kind of promise that they made to one another. Sort of like a sealing of this friendship together, a sacred oath that binds them together. So a famous Christian theologian, F.B. Meyer, seems to think it was, and I quote, "to keep up and maintain a cordial respect to each other and to support each other's interest both in life and after death." And that was what the covenant was, to treat each other that way in life and in death. And that kind of makes sense with what you see in their relationship and in the stories going forward, is both of them attempting to keep this covenant with one another. So this falls in line with something we read later on in the Bible, Proverbs 17:17, which says, "A friend loveth at all times, and a brother is born for adversity." This describes their relationship perfectly. So you have those friends that you hang out with that are fun to spend time with, and then you have those friends that you might not see them all the time, you might not hear from them all the time, but you know if push comes to shove, you can call them at a moment's notice. They're going to be there for you. So a friend loveth at all times, and a brother, and a brother is born for adversity. So you have those people in your life, that the party goer, the person you hang out with or talk to every day, and then you have those people that it's not really taking for granted, is it? But it's almost like you don't have to work so hard at maintaining a friendship, because whether good times or hard, that person's going to be there for you. And when you get to see each other, you're excited to see each other, but there's no pressure in that. And those kinds of friendships, they're extremely valuable. And I think it's the kind of friendship that David had with Jonathan. He didn't have to be constantly worrying or checking in and double making sure that Jonathan was still his friend, even though there was a lot of straining in this friendship, for something that will happen in the future. So this covenant they made together was an incredible thing. And then we see in verse 4 how David sort of gains a spiritual brother in Jonathan, which kind of goes along with what we read about in Proverbs 17:17. They're there for each other even in adversity. So he gives his garments and his robe and these things to David, his bow and his girdle, and there's a symbol, right? An item he can look at to symbolize their deep friendship and connection together. Jonathan literally takes the clothes off his back and gives to David. Literally. Hello, Christy. So you might be willing to help, like we talked about, a friend in most situations, depending on how good a friend they are, but most would go to great lengths to help their own brother or sister. Most would go to extreme lengths to help out family, especially family that you're very close to. Even if it's a distant cousin that you don't care for very much, that you never get to see, if you knew that cousin was in trouble, you'd do whatever you had to help him out. Right? Every born-again Christian is a brother or is a sister. Every saved person is a brother or a sister to every other Christian. And we ought to behave like it. And I praise you guys who do. You guys who could do better at it, something to work on, right? Something to think about, meditate on, and try to do better on. 1 John chapter 4 says there is no fear in love. That's something to consider about when it comes to our friendships, our relationships, our family relationships. Something to think about there. There is no fear in love. Right? You can't have it both ways. There are moments of fear, I think, in life and so forth and that sort of a thing. But how you feel about somebody should never be mingled with fear. That just shouldn't be the case. But perfect love casteth out fear. And you'd say, well, what about the Lord? Well, that's not true fear, is it? That's not the same thing. It's more of a reverence or respect of what God could do, not a fear of what he has done, right? Because God could destroy us if he so wanted to. He's never done that, though. And it's a respect for his capability, not his actions. Some people are in relationships where the actions have proven to produce fear. In perfect love, there is no fear in love. Perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love. We love him because he first loved us. If a man say, I love God, and hate his brother, he's a liar. Strong words, but very true. For he that loveth not his own brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? And this commandment have we from him, that he who loveth God loveth his brother also. You might not always get along with your brothers and sisters in Christ. You might disagree on things, but you should be able to get along. Right? You should be able to be in the same room. You should be able to shake each other's hands and smile, enjoy one another's company, and have respect for each other. You should not feel a pressured need to convince them of your way of thinking. Every time you see them, you should not be trying to strike up a conversation about the thing that you disagree with because you feel the compelling need to convert them to your way of thinking. It's your brother. It's your sister. You got to respectfully disagree with them. And if you can't do that, then you ought to change something. Right? If you can't get along with your own brothers and sisters in Christ, how can you claim to get along with God? Your brothers and sisters in Christ, you see eye to eye. You've never met God eye to eye, face to face. That's the point John is making there. This relationship we see between David and Jonathan, this friendship should be some sort of a goal for us, that we should strive for our own friendships in life to be as close-knit as this. We see this thought in verse 4. They're so knit together. And then in verse 5, it says that David went out whithersoever Saul sent him. So getting back to that whole thing about Jonathan's father, Saul, the reason that they met in the first place. So he's obedient to King Saul, behaved himself wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So David is now over the men of war. That's what we just read. He's in charge of the entire army of Israel. That David worked and behaved himself in such a good way that God set him over the affairs of the entire army, of the entire military force of Israel. David's obedient towards Saul and wise in his life, and God blesses him for it. He's given a promotion in the army of Israel. He's accepted in the eyes of the people of Israel. He's accepted in the eyes of all Saul's household. And if we're obedient and wise in the ways of the Lord will be with you in all the things that you do. And that's true of whether things are going your way or not. And you read things like this and you think, well, I'm doing everything God told me to do. Why isn't God blessing me the way that he blessed David? I'm being obedient. Why aren't I getting promotions and rising up and things going well for me? Just remember, this moment with David and Saul, it doesn't last. All right, I hate to spoiler warning you guys a little bit, but David spends as much time in misery as he does in, enjoying his successes. He struggles a lot during his lifetime. And whether things are going the way you want them to or not, you have to be able to recognize the fact that God is still there with you in that place. Ephesians 5:17 says, "Wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is." Sometimes the will of the Lord isn't the will of us, and those are two separate things. And we think that God wants us to have what we want because we were a good boy and now I get my bar of chocolate. Pat me on the head, give me what I want, and send me on my way. And that's not how it works. The Lord has his will that he wants to work out, and it's not always, sometimes, in some people's lives, it's hardly ever what you want. But you've got to just understand that God is sending you on a different path for a reason, and his ways are better. And we've got to trust him that we're going to follow his will, see where it takes us, and then realize that it took us to a much better place. But this is what's happening with David, and it's all good and well and great. But as we continue to read in verse 6, it says, "It came to pass when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines that the women came out of all cities of Israel." Now, David has a little trouble with the ladies. We're going to... Are you okay? Sorry, had to make sure the wife was still breathing. Anyway, she is. That's why I'm so casual about it. So the women came out of all the city of Israel as David's returning from the slaughter of the Philistines. David has not had a great time with the women. Saul had less issues with women than David did, which is a funny thing to say. But if you'll follow me on this, I think what we'll see by the end of our lesson, or by the end of our series, is that David's trouble with women leads directly to the fall of Israel. It is directly connected to what happens to Israel, what leads to their idolatry, and what leads to them rejecting the Lord for so many years. All started with David's problem with women. And you might be scratching your head thinking, how are you reasoning that out? I think by the time we get to Solomon and then the kings after Solomon, you'll begin to really see how that's the case. Because David didn't respect them the way that God said that they ought to be respected. As a matter of fact, there's a verse, I've got it in my notes. If you can give me a second to pull it up. Not tonight. I'm not following down that rabbit trail. But talks about the kings and, polygamy and that sort of thing, and how it shouldn't be the case. So we do see that direct correlation. But the women come out of the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets of joy and instruments of music. And the women answered one to another as they played and said, "Saul has slain his thousands, And that's a fine thing. That's what a tremendous thing to say about your king. But then they go on to say, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Now, when the women sang this, I'm quite sure they meant no disrespect to King Saul at all. They're still giving Saul credit for his victories, but they're also giving credit to the leader of his armies. Right? Saul was at least wise enough to put David as the leader of his armies, I think was the point they were trying to make. But that's not the way that Saul took it. Because we see in verse 8, exactly. We see in verse 8 it says, Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. What more can they have but the kingdom? Quite a big jump he made there, didn't he? So as we're reading this, we're seeing Saul is mad because David's getting credit for more slayings than he is. Almost like David's a better warrior than him. And again, remember, the only reason, it is true, but the only reason that it's true is because Saul has rejected God. And David is winning these battles because he's fighting these battles with God on his side. It's the same reason he beat Goliath, when Saul should have been the one to beat Goliath and never even went onto the battlefield. David won that battle. Now he's the leader of the army, the one that Saul put him in the first place. All of these credits should be slightly attributed to Saul as well. He was wise enough to pick David. That's the point in the first place. But instead, he sees it like, oh, David's after my job. David's coming after me. He wants my job. I can't tell you. I hesitate to say this online. But maybe I should parse my words a little more. But I have experienced at all three of the other churches that I've worked at other than Faith Baptist Church, I have experienced a moment where the pastor or somebody on the staff has decided that I was after their job. At every other church I've worked, this has happened. And they see me as a threat, even though all I ever wanted to do was worship and serve the Lord under their leadership. It never went that way. They always got threatened, and they always found an excuse to force me to leave. Every single time. That's a hard thing for me to talk about because there were also so many wonderful moments in those churches and so much that I learned, and I looked up to them a lot like David looks up to Saul. And when David finds out that Saul feels this way about him, it breaks his heart. And I can understand that because it's very hard to find out that somebody you looked up to is now sort of coming after you. Now, to their credit, thank you, Amanda. I appreciate the support. But to their credit, nobody threw a javelin at my head. So it never got that far. There were some tactics that were a little underhanded. We won't go into details, obviously. That's not what the point of this. The point of this is to say that that happens. Sometimes good men, like Saul, they make bad choices, right? People are people at the end of the day, and you got to be careful about idolizing them. A pastor is just a person, just like you. You shouldn't just eat and swallow everything they hand you. You should check it to the Bible. And if the Bible doesn't back them up, don't believe it. Don't go along with it. We got to stop this thing of it. Just like David idolized Saul, and it caused such heartache for him toward the end. And he gets very mad, and it says in verse 9 that Saul eyed David from that day forward. That's a heartbreaking thing. I've been there. Now, it's going to get to a point where I can no longer relate, right? He's going to get, kicked out of the kingdom, all this, chased and tried to murder by this guy. I've never had any of that happen, obviously. But, yeah. But, this idea of being sort of betrayed by a person you looked up to is something I think all of us have a version of in our life. You live long enough, you see that happen, right? So we all have a story like that, that we kind of can relate to David and what he's going through. But what was supposed to be a celebration for God's people over a victory against an enemy that's been plaguing them for quite a long time, it actually turns into a reason for Saul to hate a loyal soldier that saw him as a father figure, only ever fought in Saul's name, and considered that to be an incredible honor. Matthew 5 says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy." But in verse 44, Jesus says, "I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." A Christian never has the excuse to treat people the way that Saul treated David. It's always wrong, no matter how scared or intimidated you feel by somebody, because you need to remember that perfect love driveth out fear. There is no fear in love, and if you're afraid of somebody for no good reason, then you need to check how you feel. And if that person has made them your enemy, you should still treat them right, regardless. Because it's not about showing favor to those that we like and coming back at those that we don't. You're a Christian or you're not. And at the end of the day, if you are, then you trust the Lord. You live your life like a Christian, which includes being nice to people when you don't want to be. Thank you. Saul now hates and fears David because he knows that David has what Saul once had. And at the end of the day, that's what it came down to. David, as a young man, has a relationship with God that gives him a special kind of strength. We saw it with Goliath. Rock gets flung, knocks in the forehead, guy falls over dead. Actually falls this way. Boom, dead. None of the Israel soldiers were even willing to try. Even the king himself was too scared to try. And David had an incredible victory that can only be God, right? Well, the thing about it is, and the things that makes Saul so upset, is that that's what he once had with God, was these incredible victories in the power of God, just like David's now experiencing. Saul was starting to learn to rely on his own strength instead of the strength of God. He had these hype men all around him praising him, lifting him up, talking about how great he was. He started to believe it. And he started to lean less and less on the Lord and more on his own hype and his own strength. And we've talked about that. We saw that decline. And now he's seeing this young man, David, fighting in the strength of God that he once had but no longer does. And it's starting to make him feel a little jealous. And he's starting to see the handwriting on the wall, and he's starting to understand that David might be the one to take his place. This isn't because that's what David wanted, though. It's because it's what God wanted. But in Saul's mind, that's been a little warped and twisted. He's made this into a thing where David's secretly trying to take over. David's going to, create a coup. And that wasn't the case at all. It was that God had picked David as the next king. And that God and his will was to move on from Saul. Of course, that's not what Saul wants. That's not what he wants to be true. So he pretends like David is doing all of this. Ephesians 6:10 says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might." David had it. Saul missed it. But not because of the Lord. Not for any of the right reasons. Saul wanted that strength back. He wanted to fight and get all the glory like David was getting. But the only reason David had that strength was because it was about God, not about David. He had a love for the Lord. He had a love for his word. Even before he was fighting giants, before he was battling in the name of Saul, he was the psalmist of Israel in the shepherd's field, writing some of these psalms we have in our Bibles today. Psalm 23 was before Goliath, while he was still a shepherd boy. He had a relationship with God, and that's what Saul misunderstands. It wasn't about the strength or the victories or the accolades. David just loves the Lord. And that's what Saul was missing. But as we continue reading, it says in verse 10, "It came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul. He prophesied in the midst of the house, and David played with his hand as at other times." We've read before where David played the harp and it soothed the evil spirit of Saul. The only problem with that now is that evil spirit is now aimed at the one who's playing the harp. So the music is not doing for him what it was once doing, because the person playing the music he's incredibly jealous of and hates. So now he's playing this harp so beautifully, and Saul's thinking, oh, of course, he can do that too. Sure, he can play music, he can sing like an angel, he can fight better than me. What else can he do? And he's getting so angry, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And unfortunately, I think you know where this is going. That's never a great way for a story to turn. So by the way, I don't know, it's important for you to know in the story, Saul was holding this javelin, and you immediately go, oh no. Oh yes. As the Kool-Aid man once said, oh yeah. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. So, twice. Let me explain to you what that means, because it's such a big deal. First of all, we see that David went in to soothe the heart of Saul, got jealous of David over this, shot a javelin, hurled it out of his hand, football spiral style, trying to nail David to the wall with it. He wanted the spear to go through the body of David and into the wall and pin him to the wall with it. That's what he was aiming for. He wanted that spear to go through his body and murder him, is what he wanted. And he did it. Have you ever had such a terrible thought as that? And then, you know, you possibly very quickly go, wow, that was awful. I can't believe I even thought that. He not only had the thought, he followed through and actually hurled the thing at David, trying to murder him. And here comes the incredible part. David escapes, is able to leave, and then comes back to try again. Because it said twice. David avoided out of his presence twice. David came back for more. That's bravery, folks. That's saying something bad may happen to me, but if I can help the king, I'd rather. So this happened twice with David. And it says in verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, and was departed from Saul. So after the second time, David was like, maybe I shouldn't be in the same room as Saul anymore. This doesn't seem to be helping. Therefore Saul removed him from him and made him his captain over 1,000, and went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. So now he's looking for an excuse why he can kill David and nobody be mad at him for it, because he is still king of all these people, right? If you wear a crown and sit on a fancy chair, you're not really a king, you're just a weirdo. A king needs a kingdom. It needs people. And if his people rebel against him because he's just murdering everybody he decides he doesn't like, he no longer has a kingdom and is therefore no longer a king. But in verse 16, it said, all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. Saul had evidently developed this idea of ivory towers. He stayed in his palace all day long, behaving like a king, taking for himself, acting a bit spoiled. But David was in among the people. You know, he's walking in and out of the guard towers. Hey, Frank, how you doing? How's the wife? How's that kid? Tell him I said hello, would you? You know, hey, Bob, the apple's selling today. Oh, man, that's so great. Oh, you got some new sheep there. I love sheep. What's this one? You know, he's in there with the people. Knows everybody's name. Everybody loves David. Saul's kind of isolated himself, which always makes things worse. If you're feeling bad, you're feeling depressed, you're feeling like the world is out to get you, remember that it's not, and that the devil is trying to trick you into thinking it is. Reach out to somebody, because your isolation only makes it worse. Reach out to somebody. If they're a jerk to you about it, understand that they're a jerk and not you. Reach out to somebody else. This was Saul's problem. I think to a certain degree Saul knew what his problem was, but he just wanted people to cater to him. And God was not pleased with that. But then we see here in verse 17, it says that Saul said to David, "Behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul said, "Let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him." In other words, he was hoping he was going to die in battle. What an awful thing. David said unto Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life, or my father's family in Israel, that I should be the son-in-law to the king?" Remember, his grandmother, or was it great-grandmother, was Ruth, the Moabitess woman that was nothing, not even an Israelite, and had to be redeemed back in order to be a member of the family. And then you go back a few generations before that, and you get Rahab, who was a prostitute by profession. She was a harlot. She was a prostitute in the city of Jericho as it was taken by Joshua. And David's thinking to himself, I have no pedigree. Who am I? I have no royal blood in my family or nobility that my family should be made part of the bloodline of the kings of Israel. What a tremendous honor and thing I can do for my family and for the future generations of my family. This is where David's head was. But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given unto Adriel, the Meholathite, to wife. So I think this is where David's problem with women comes in. He was so excited about being part of the family of the kings of Israel, the anointed kings of Israel, and now his family was going to be a part of those families. And he was so excited about it. And then it didn't happen. And it almost became, this relationship to him was about the, not the status, but it was about the honor of being part of the royal family of Israel. And it wasn't about Merab. It wasn't about the woman herself. It wasn't about, who is this woman? Do I love her? Do I have any relationship with her? Does she love me? It wasn't about any of that. And I think that's where David's poor attitude toward women really starts to take root here, is in this place in verse 19. But in verse 20 it says, Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. Okay, so now we see the difference, right? Because before, that word was never used. We don't know how Merab felt about David. She was being tossed around from man to man. You're going to marry him. No, you're going to marry him. And it was a bad thing that David picked up on. But in verse 20, we see that Michal, Saul's daughter, did love David. They told Saul, and the thing pleased him. But not for the reason it should have. My daughter found love. What a tremendous thing. I should hope that my children find something as tremendous as love in their life. Right? That should have been the attitude. It was not. Verse 21, Saul said, I will give her that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, Thou shalt be this day my son-in-law in the one of them twain. And Saul commanded his servant, saying, Continue with David secretly, and say, Behold, the king hath delighted in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. And the servants spake these words in the ears of David, probably because they thought they were true. And David said, Seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, On this manner spake David. So we see the polar opposite of Saul and David is what we're seeing in these passages. We're seeing that while we have seen for many weeks now how Saul has fallen into the pitfalls of a prideful king, we now see the incredible humility of David. And we're reminded in Proverbs 29:23 that a man's pride shall bring him low, but honor shall uphold the humble in spirit. That's what we're seeing here. The prideful man, He's trying to set traps. They're not working because David's humility is keeping him safe. You are much more difficult to catch in a trap if you remain humble. We see also that there was nothing that Saul could do against David. All these traps he set for him, and as we continue to read, in verse 25, Saul said, "Thus shall you say to David, the king desires now a dowry, payment for marrying his daughter, a dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines." That's gross and creepy and weird on levels I can't begin to explain to you. Saul, what is wrong with you, man? You want what? Dude, you need to talk to somebody. You talk to Samuel, who you need to talk to, but holy nasty. To be avenged of the king's enemies, but Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines, because that means obviously killing 100 Philistines on his own. So hoping that David would die in battle, which is an awful thing to hope. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. So now David's thinking, okay, well, I don't really deserve it, but maybe I can earn it. And that's kind of where his head was. This is a really intense thing to ask somebody. Maybe that's because this is the only way for me to prove that I've earned the right to be a part of the king's bloodline. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, which is a moment you're not going to find in your Precious Moments Bible. You're just not going to find that one there. And David brought their foreskins and gave them in full tale to the king. "I don't need those tails, David. You can keep those locked away in an ironclad box at the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. I don't need those tails." That he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. Now this is the one we mentioned in verse 20 that did love David. There is love in this relationship. And it's a beautiful thing. However, David's already been kind of messed up in his relationships because of what happened before. And we're going to see that sort of unfortunately play out in the coming chapters of this book. And Saul knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, and Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Notice it didn't say that David became Saul's enemy, or that they were mutually enemies. It said that Saul became David's enemy. Folks, we're going to have people that pop up in our lives that choose to be our enemies. The same cannot be true in reverse. You just stay true to the Lord, he will keep you. And if one of these traps works in a way you don't want them to, then it was because it was the Lord's will and you're headed towards something different, and you're just going to have to trust the Lord on it. Believe me from experience. And also because it's in the Bible. Mostly that one. But in verse 30 it said, "The princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass that as they went forth, that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by." Romans 8:31 says, "What shall we say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us?" Like David, so long as we remain faithful to the Lord, we have a very powerful ally in the battles of life. David wasn't even aware he was fighting a battle on two fronts, out against the Philistines and against King Saul. And yet the Lord kept him in all these things. And what a tremendous thing it is to see. So, like I said, as we continue forward, we're going to see King Saul get a little more extreme in these things, and it'd be a tragedy for David, but one that sort of forges him into the kind of man that God needs him to be to lead the nation of Israel. I hope this lesson has touched you in some way. I hope it's been encouraging to you. Maybe it inspired you with something, or something you've dealt with in the past, or maybe something you're dealing with right now. Anyway, that is our lesson for this evening. Thank you guys so much for being here and being a part of it. We'll be back on Sunday morning for our next Sunday school lesson. We're going to continue in the life of Paul. So that'll be a